Okay. Our next speaker is Robert Prentner, who's going to tell us about applied category theory for the study of the first-person perspective. Take it away, Robert.
Yes, thank you very much. Thanks to Sean and Johannes for organizing this workshop, and thanks in particular to for giving me the opportunity to present my work remotely today. I'm interested in the, I would say, opportunities and challenges that arise when trying to think about whether one could apply category theory to the study of consciousness. If you want a single take-home message, so to say, I think category theory is most usefully applied to consciousness when one uses it to systematically represent a first-person perspective of phenomenology. I must say that my talk will be much more pedestrian than the previous talk, I guess, and I apologize in advance if there are any repetitions of what has already been said throughout this workshop. Okay. So let me start this talk by giving you a brief outline of what I will talk today. I will first start with an introduction, a conceptual introduction about something which I call the received view in thinking about the relation between the brain and mind, between consciousness and the brain. I illustrated it with an old example drawn from the 1990s without using category theory, and then I will discuss a more recent example which actually invokes category theory, which will bring me to some questions and possible issues with this received view, this way of thinking about the relation between mind and matter. That will lead me then to my second part of my talk, which is about the first-person perspective. I will start with a now classic paper by Thomas Nagel that's very often cited and often referred to. Unfortunately, it's not quite often read in its entirety, but I will motivate some of the stuff which I was doing using some part of that paper. I will then give you a very brief introduction about phenomenology and some characteristics of phenomenology. And before I come to the third part of my talk, I will try to diffuse a common misunderstanding that people often have, that phenomenology is more or less the same as psychology, or is a specific branch of psychology. I think that's something which was decidedly refuted by phenomenologists themselves. In the end, afterwards, my third part, the last part of my talk, will be about category theory, finally, about ways of applying category theory to the study of consciousness, how one would think about it. I will present you a table of possible analogies, of possible ways where I see a relation, and I will then illustrate that with an extended example, a world of objects or a self. Okay, starting with the received view, the way how many people now in the scientific study of consciousness think about the problem is that you have the brain on one hand, and the brain is doing whatever the brain is doing, and on the other hand you have a category of consciousness, or you have consciousness on the other hand, and people think that some brain states relate to conscious experience. I deliberately left it a bit vague here. What relates to specifically means that really depends on the specific theory of consciousness you're working with. It also depends on some very specific metaphysical assumptions, so whether you're a physicalist, or whether you're a dualist, or whether you're something else, all determines a bit how you think about this relates to. Now in the 1990s, what emerged is a very successful empirical strategy that somehow puts those difficult theoretical and philosophical questions aside, which brackets those metaphysical assumptions, and that's the strategy of finding the so-called neural correlates of consciousness. That was a very, it is a very successful research program, even though it has certain problems. But the good thing is that you can pursue this research program without worrying too much about the philosophical story. Okay, so now To give you a very old example from the 1990s, actually, from the early work of Dave Chalmers. Chalmers did many important and famous things, and one of those things was the definition of an NCC. An NCC is a minimal neural system such that there is a mapping from states of N to states of consciousness, where a given state of N is sufficient under condition C for the corresponding state of consciousness. The details of this definition do not really matter at this point. There are other definitions, there are refinements of that definition, there have been arguments whether it's a good definition or not. Doesn't really matter. And there are two keywords which I think are important. On the one hand, minimal neural system. So you want to be a bit more specific. You do not want to talk about the brain as a whole, but the specific area or specific network in the brain. The second keyword of that definition, which is important, is the claim of sufficiency. It's not the same as saying it's necessary for consciousness. So a lot of things which you would want to do with the NCC, you can actually not do with the NCC, because then you need a necessary definition. David Chalmers also, in his first book in 1996, he proposed the so-called principle of structural coherence. What is the principle of structural coherence? Well, it's the claim of a coherence between structures of awareness and consciousness, where awareness is there's a very specific way how Chalmers thinks about awareness. Awareness can be fully described functionally in terms of, for example, what the brain is doing, and according to a specific theory, if you want, global workspace theory or some other theory. And the important thing about the structural coherence principle is that the relation between the structures of awareness and consciousness is said to be one of isomorphism. So Chalmers was very explicit about this idea that there must be an isomorphism, and that was motivated on empirical and philosophical grounds. But importantly, that way of thinking about things, about thinking about the mind-matter relation, didn't involve any category theory. In the next example, which is a bit more modern, that changed. Category theory became really important in that example, and that goes back to a proposal. I think some of the authors of that paper are here in the audience today. So whereas Chalmers back then thought about awareness, or what the brain was doing, something which is important for understanding this thing which is called awareness. The brain side of things, so to say, in this paper was proposed to be dealt with a different theory of consciousness, the integrated information theory of consciousness. And in a nutshell, in IIT, certain structures, which come out from the postulates of IIT, MICS, maximally irreducible conceptual structures. Now the IIT proponents talk about cause-effect structures, were proposed to be linked to conscious experiences. And in the original IIT proposal, IIT proponents were quite explicit about this relation being a relation of identity. In this paper, this was relaxed. Very interesting. You have two categories. On the one hand, the category of the brain, on the other hand, the category of consciousness, and then you're interested in the relation of those things. So it's also a relation between structures. Now, if IIT were right, then there would be an identity between the MICS and qualia. You would expect something to be, you would expect an isomorphism, but maybe isomorphism is not the right relationship. Maybe it's something else. And a very weak ingredient, so the different senses of strength, informally speaking, and the weakest one would be expressed by a functor between categories. That's still quite unspecified, but it already enables you to say some interesting things. Which actually brings me to some critical questions to this approach or to this way of thinking about the mind-matter relationship. The first question is, an obvious question is, well, can we say something useful which cannot be said in much simpler ways? So could we say something like this without using category theory? That's an obvious, a bit nasty question. The second question is whether it's adequate to talk about consciousness this way. So, for example, Chalmers believed that consciousness is not exhausted by a purely structural understanding. There must be something else, some other ingredient to better understand consciousness. And the question would be summarized as a question as a question that asks, where do we actually stand now with the second category? And that will be the main focus of the remainder of my talk. So ways to respond to those two critical questions. To the first question, one could say, well, category theory is very interesting and very useful because it allows us to do some kinds of inferences which might not be doable in the absence of a fully specified theory of consciousness. Category theory might help us to get a more systematic understanding of the relation between consciousness and the brain. We do not just want to have point-wise neural correlates, but we want to know how correlates, so to say, hang together. And the third point, which is particularly important for the scientific study of consciousness in its current state, is the question of theory integration. So as you might know, there are many theories of consciousness out there, but what's really difficult is to integrate them under a common framework, and category theory might provide some high-level tools to do just that. But anyway, that would be a possible response to this first nasty question, but I'm actually more concerned with the second question, how should we adequately talk about consciousness? And I think that's the way to do that is actually doing proper phenomenology. And I will now outline what I mean by that. And eventually, I won't talk much about that in my talk. What we really would want to do in the end is to explain those correlations, to get a better idea, better understanding about the nature of those correlations. Why do the correlations hold in the first place? But I think that's stuff for the future, so to say. First, let's do proper phenomenology. And in my opinion, when we do proper phenomenology, that will already provide us with some insights into the larger question about correlation. Okay, but first, before I talk about phenomenology, I want to go back to this paper by Thomas Nagel, What is it like to be a bat, from the Philosophical Review. Nagel, it's actually it's from the very last page of that paper. So most people know what it is like, less idea of the paper, and most people know this metaphor about the bat. But the very last part of the paper is often not so well known. Nagel wrote that setting aside temporarily the relation between the mind and the brain, we can pursue a more objective understanding of the mental in its own right. So what Nagel complained about throughout this paper is actually conceptual inability, our conceptual inability to grasp this first-person perspective that we have in experience. And it's somewhat misleadingly, Nagel used the notion of a point of view, but that was his way of conveying the message. And then at the very end, Nagel said something like, which I found very interesting: this should be regarded as a challenge to form new concepts and devise a new method, an objective phenomenology, not dependent on empathy or the imagination. So Nagel wants us to be able to answer this question, what is it like to be a bat? And he argued in that paper, we only can answer a question, what is it like for us to behave or to be physically similar to a bat? But that's not really the question. The question is, what is it like to be a bat? But to answer that question, we need we need new concepts, which have to do with the first personal perspective on experience. Okay. Now, I think if you want to answer to Nagel, if you want to proceed with this project of coming up with a more objective way of doing phenomenology, there are already some resources present. And in my opinion, the best resource, which is available to us now, goes back back to philosophical phenomenology. Philosophical phenomenology, for example, Husserlian phenomenology, there are many different branches of phenomenology. So some common features of phenomenology is that phenomenology is the systematic study of first-person experience, and systematic is very important. It's not just introspection, but it's a systematic way of connecting different instances of introspectively available data. Phenomenology, different traditions of phenomenology usually converge on this idea that experience or describing experience, maybe even explaining experience, comprises various aspects. Most importantly, an aspect which is related to a self, an aspect which is related to a world, and most phenomenologists also emphasize that our experience in time is very important. I think you heard a little bit about that already. Temporal experience is a kind of recurring topic in phenomenology. And the third point, which is characteristic of phenomenology, is that phenomenology is trying to proceed in terms of subjective and objective concepts. What I mean by this, in a very naive view, you would say, well, subjective and objective are somehow marking the limits of consciousness and non-consciousness. So you have some subjectivity in here, and then you have objectivity out there, but that's not really what phenomenologists are saying. They would say, oh, this distinction, this subject-object distinction, is actually a distinction which happens within consciousness. Different authors spell it out a bit differently, and there's a lot of terminological confusion. So, for example, the early Husserl spoke of act-object distinctions or act-matter distinctions. Later in his ideas, he talked about noesis and noema, and there's a lot of discussion going on what's really meant by that and what's the metaphysical story and how those things relate. But I think that's part of phenomenology scholarship that doesn't interest me specifically in this part. What I think what is more interesting and what is more important is to say that, well, phenomenology can be approached in a mathematical, rigorous way. Now, before I sketch some ideas how this mathematical and rigorous way could actually be approached, I want to dispel one common misunderstanding about phenomenology, namely that phenomenology is just the same as cognitive psychology or a branch of psychology. Husserl gave an interesting quote. He said, I can sharply emphasize from the start that pure phenomenology is not psychology, and that neither accidental delimitations of its field nor its terminologies, but most radical essential grounds prevent its inclusion in psychology. That quote is a translation from a German quote. If you think that the German original is easier to read and is more comprehensible, then you're wrong. It's just an illustration that Husserl was not the best writer, and it's sometimes very hard to actually make sense of what he says. So I try to illustrate that with an analogy of proportions. Husserl believed that phenomenologists usually believe that the relation of phenomenology to psychology is the same, or at least analogous, to the relation of mathematics to physics. So phenomenology is really about exploring the conceptual and logical foundation in which phenomena could happen, in which experience could happen, in which phenomena could be related to each other. And what are these most radical essential grounds that Husserl talks about? Well, Husserl specifically believed that when phenomenologists analyze this conceptual logical structure, which is foundational for experience, then the way how they do that is to try to grasp certain ideas or essences about these logical structures. And that's what he thought would be is characteristic of phenomenology and is not found in other empirical sciences such as psychology. Okay, now that brings me to the very last part which is actually about category theory. Now I decided, instead of going through all these notions and trying to explain all these notions, which will take a lot of time and is very complicated probably, I give you a kind of overview over notions in phenomenology and possible ways to translate that into concept in category theory. The very first thing is a relation between the basic constituents, so to say. In our theory of phenomenology, we speak about experiences that could be related to types in category theory. One nice feature about phenomenology is that it's not so much concerned with the question, oh, what are experiences in themselves? What makes experiences different to anything else? It's more concerned with this question, how do experiences hang together? How are experiences related to each other? Which kind of naturally leads, in my opinion, to this notion of a process in applied category theory. This idea to have transformations which are defined over things that stand for experience. And in phenomenological terms, you would speak of constitutions in consciousness. There's another nice analogy here. The word constitution is a bit broad in phenomenology. It encompasses many different things. So there's a constitution of individual objects of experience, there's a constitution of your total experience, there's a constitution of the world, a constitution of reality, and so on and so on. So what that means is actually that various ways of constituting things can be hierarchically structured, can be composed. And that sounds very similar to ideas of category theory. Now, to be a bit more specific, in phenomenology, some of the most radical essential grounds that Husserl was alluding to previously are, for example, given by the concept of a self, the pre-reflective self, or by the concept of intentionality, which could be translated very meaningfully, in my opinion, to certain properties of compositions, which can happen in sequence or in parallel in category theory. So there's a nice match between that. There's another nice match between rewriting rules that you have in category theory and various senses of unity in phenomenology. And the unity of consciousness, I'm sure you have heard about that in many different contexts. The theme of the unity of consciousness is that there are many different versions of the unity, so to say. There are very different kinds of unity. One could at least make following distinction. There's a diachronic unity and a synchronic unity, meaning a unity across time and a unity of consciousness at any given point in time. Now, phenomenologists believe usually that these different senses of unity are very intimately related to each other. So there's a way how to get from synchronic unity to diachronic unity and the other way around. And I think that's very nice, that can be very nicely translated to the validity of certain rewriting rules in category theory. The last analogy, which I will be alluding to, is the one of phenomenological reflection. Phenomenologists usually believe that you can not only have experience and analyze experience, but you can go to a higher reflective mode and think about experience from this reflective perspective, and then you can start to reflect on your reflection, and so on and so on. And that seems to be reminiscent of higher category theory. So there are a lot of similarities, and I would say the list is incomplete. There are many interesting topics in phenomenology which could be given a category theoretical reading. So, for example, one could focus on the experience of time in the phenomenology of time consciousness and tell a category theoretical story about that. One can kind of focus a bit more on these rewriting rules. That would be very interesting. But I note one caveat, that we need a low-level theory of consciousness to see how these concepts are actually implemented. So, for example, to see the validity of certain rewriting rules. And one theory which I am personally quite fond of is conscious agent theory. There are other theories in consciousness studies which are interesting. So for example, Sean and Johannes wrote a nice paper about process theory and integrated information theory. That would be another interesting candidate to look at. Those people who found that overview a bit too superficial and too less detailed can have a look at my paper, which is linked here, and there's a bit more discussion of these things in the paper. But instead of going more into depth with respect to any one of these concepts, I decided to give you a little toy example, so to say, how some of these ideas could be used to better understand the phenomenological analysis, and that will make up the last slides, the last two slides of my talk. Okay, first, a word of objects. What you will typically start with in phenomenology, you will try to analyze what phenomenologists call the natural attitude, which is our natural, to say, naive way to thinking about our conscious experience, about the way our conscious experience is given to us. And we would normally maybe say something like that: the world that we experience, it consists of objects which appear to be composed of other objects and the relations between those objects. That already sounds a bit like, that it's kind of amenable to this category theoretic treatment, but it's of course very angry and superficial at this point. Now, what phenomenologists typically add now would be to say, well, that's okay, that's a description of this natural attitude, but then we need to take a step back from this natural attitude. We need to bracket our assumptions about the natural attitude, and then we find certain processes which underlie this description of the natural attitude. And what phenomenologists would maybe say is that certain objects, or the objects which I was just speaking about, are actually constituted in consciousness. They're not just items in the world, so to say, that we find, but we actively constitute them. Objects are made, they are resultant of processes. Now, that maybe could be represented categorically, but instead of going into some details, I'll just give you a nice example. When phenomenologists look at the very ordinary object like the table I'm sitting at, and they would say, well, the table is not only just an image of a physical object table, but it's really a fusion of a certain projection of this image, of this table, fused together with possible other ways of experiencing the table, fused with possible ways of how I could behave with respect to the table. I could jump on it, I could ride on it, and has certain affordances for me. It's also a fusion of certain expected experiences which I would have with respect to the table. If I would roll down the table, then I would expect maybe to see it in a certain way. That influences the way how this consciously experienced table is given to me. So that's one sense how objects are constituted according to phenomenology. That's of course not all, that's just one aspect.
Robert, I just say you've got 2 minutes including questions, so if you want a question.
It's all very well, I'm already coming to that. So how many minutes have I talked?
Like 2 minutes left, but that's including your question, so...
Okay. The second aspect would be the aspect of the self. Phenomenologists sometimes sound a bit as if they were assuming that there was a substantial self, but actually that's not quite what they say. What they say, there's something like a pre-reflective self. A pre-reflective self could be understood in a functional way, and functional quotations, as expressing certain structural features of experience, like allowance of composing experience. It's very interesting in this context to know that for phenomenologists, they believe that pre-reflective selves on one level could become genuine self-objects if we go to a more reflective mode of experience, and that brings me back to this reminiscence of higher category theory of thinking about categories of categories. Okay, that's it. With that, I'm actually concluding. So if there's one message of my talk, it's just that phenomenology is actually useful, and one should try to categorically analyze and analogize phenomenology to get going with this Hegelian objective phenomenology project. And with that, I'm thanking you very much for your attention, and thanks for being here and for listening to me.
Everybody wants one quick question? They can come up. Oh yeah? I think the mic's here. Well, if you stand in front of the camera, and you can lower the ceiling. Yeah.
Okay. Hi Robert, thank you very much for the talk. So since you mentioned Chalmers and Nagel, I was kind of wondering what you think about the hard problem of consciousness. So if we have some sort of mechanism to compute states in certain space that we can relate to the subjective components of our experience, and how far does it explain that we experience it? Just would like to have your take on that. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the question. A very simple way to think about this hard problem is to think about if you stick with this correlational view. I mean, we have these correlations, and we know that these correlations are, maybe we can even make predictions, but we still don't know what these correlations are, why they should hold in the first place, and what is the nature of these correlations, how to explain that. And the hard problem basically deals with our inability of explaining these correlations.
Okay, thank you. Let's thank Robert again.